Our Parsha, Shoftim, deals with judges, with the Supreme Court, the Jewish main Bet Din, which was called by the Greek word Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin, but the Torah just calls it a place where Hashem will choose, which eventually became Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, which is where the Supreme Court, the 71 elders, were sitting and deciding all the halachot, all the Jewish law that would not be clear. So the Torah describes it as when you have various questions, something that you're not sure about, you'll go to that place and you have to follow exactly what they tell you. You're not supposed to turn right or left from what they say, yamin or smol. And it's known what the halachic Midrash Sifrei brings on this, and Rashi and many commentators quote it. Even if the sages tell you that your right is left and your left is right, meaning you think they're totally wrong, you think they're telling you obviously incorrect halacha, you still have to follow them. And the purpose of this is, of course, unity. That's more important, even if there is a mistake. In fact, the Daf Yomi cycle of the Talmud, the cycle of reading one page of Talmud per day, soon is going to get to exactly the Masechet, the tractate called Horayot, which deals exactly with this type of scenario, that the great Sanhedrin, the main Jewish Bet Din, the Supreme Court, can make a mistake. Yes, it's possible. They may decide, for instance, that, let's say, for example, imagine in our day when Sanhedrin would be sitting and deciding if one is allowed to turn on electric light on Shabbat. Right? There was no electric light in the times of Talmud, but today there is, and about 100 years ago, a lot of tshuvot were written on this subject, and the vast majority of rabbis concluded that it's forbidden, and many concluded that it's forbidden midoraita, from the Torah, meaning even though the Torah, of course, doesn't talk about electricity, but there are certain laws and certain principles the Talmud tells us, the precedents from which we could learn that turning on electric light is forbidden biblically, possibly. I'm not going to discuss, of course, the details of this. Right now, for the purpose of my example, I'm only trying to say that, let's say, imagine that in our day, we would have the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, and at first they would decide that halacha is it's permitted to turn on the light, electric light on Shabbat. And then later they decided that they made a mistake. They were convinced that the original psak was wrong. So this is exactly what the Tractate Horayot, it's the shortest tractate, by the way, in Babylonian Talmud. It's only 13 or so pages. That tractate deals with specifically this type of issue. If the great Supreme Court made a mistake, and what happens then? Sometimes when the majority of people followed the psak, it's considered their fault, not the fault of the individuals. But the point of the matter is that this is a possibility. The Torah accounts for this type of possibility. Even the Supreme Court could make a mistake. So they could paskin, they could decide some halacha incorrectly. But guess what? It's more important, as many commentators say, including Sefer HaChinuch, that it's more important that people would have uniform practice, even if it could be a mistake, rather than everybody has their own Torah. Just like lehavdil in American law, if everybody would decide the law to themselves, it would be terrible, it would be chaos. But instead, there's Supreme Court. Of course, Jewish law is far more elaborate because it goes through all aspects of life, kashrut and Shabbat and all kinds of laws. But the ideal is that there would be one Supreme Court that everybody follows their opinion. And if they made a mistake, okay, so if they realize their mistake, then it's their fault and they brought a certain karban, but this is better than if everybody who thinks that they're wrong would do whatever they think, and the Torah would become many Torot. Now, in practice today, we do not have such a Supreme Court. Even what they call chief rabbis in certain countries, they don't really have full authority. In America, there is no such institute altogether. In England, I think there is a chief rabbi. I think it's more like a political role. In Russia, there is a chief rabbi, maybe even more than one, I'm not sure. In Israel, there are a few chief rabbis. There is a Sephardic chief rabbi and an Ashkenazic, and even the Ethiopian Jews, they have their chief rabbi. It's a very small community, and it's not particularly, it's not as busy. The office of the chief rabbi of Ethiopians is far less busy than the other two chief rabbis. But whatever the case may be, it doesn't mean that all Ashkenazim, for instance, follow the chief rabbi of Israel. Even in Israel, it's not true at all. In fact, his role is more political, and in certain cases, maybe some people follow him, but he does not really have, nor is there a Supreme Court concept today that every Jew, or even if, let's say, every Jew in Israel would follow. Rather, today there are usually local rabbis, and some rabbis are more authoritative than others. Certainly, in today's day and age, the psaks of certain Hasidic groups, usually they ask their rabbis, and by Sephardim, by the way, the chief rabbi of Israel usually does have a lot of authority, but also not full authority. At some point, Rav Ovadia Yosef by Sephardim was one of the most accepted rabbis. A very large percentage of Sephardic Jews followed his rulings, his psaks. But even they didn't all, not all Sephardim followed Rav Ovadia Yosef. And other chief rabbis are usually even less famous and less authoritative. So it's a normal situation today when we don't have Supreme Court that people ask their local rabbi or a rabbi they generally ask. But it used to be that there was a Sanhedrin, a Supreme Court, and the questions that were doubtful often were decided by the Supreme Court. So as I said, the interpretation that Rashi and others bring is that we're supposed to follow them even if we think they're wrong. Now, the interesting part is, though, that the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi, brings in Masechet Horayot in the beginning a sort of opposite drasha. It says there that if you think that the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, made a mistake, you're not supposed to follow, at least when they're lenient in something, you're not supposed to break, let's say, Shabbat. If you think that what they allowed is really breaking Shabbat or breaking some other commandment, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to follow them. And the darshan apparently from the same psukim, that you're not supposed to turn right or left, meaning that when they say on the right, on the left, not when they say the opposite. When they made a mistake, you're not supposed to follow them. The truth is, even Babylonian Talmud doesn't have the exact same drasha, but it does imply that it would be mistaken to think that if the Sanhedrin, made a mistake, you're supposed to follow them. That's wrong. That's plain wrong. You're not supposed to follow the Sanhedrin when they made a mistake. So how do you reconcile the two? The first time, by the way, I dealt with this question was like 25 or more years ago. I remember exactly how I was sitting in a shul, in a synagogue, and I was thinking about it. Where do I look? At that time, there were much less sources. The internet was just developing. I don't think we were using internet for any kind of Jewish studies at that time. And at that time already, they had a Franklin Rambam. That's an edition of Maimonides or of Rambam that has many different sources in the back. I was told by someone who is in the know, there was a whole group of people, by the way, working on it. It wasn't a one-person publisher. There was a very hard work they put into that Rambam. And somebody told me, look, there are a lot of sources in there. Why don't you look and see how they bring where to look, which rabbinical writings try to reconcile those two. And I looked, and indeed, there was tens of different rabbis who already discussed this topic, of course. Right? This is a very well-known contradiction that needs a resolution. So I looked into some of these books. Not all of these books were available, but the answer I like the most is the answer that Ramban gives. And that is that when a certain person who is on a level, of course, we're not talking about a person who barely knows the Torah, but he thinks the rabbis are wrong. Obviously, he has no say. We're talking about a person who is quite knowledgeable. And he has good reasons to believe that the rabbis made a mistake. So he is supposed to bring his arguments before the rabbis, meaning as long as he did not come to the rabbis and bring his arguments, he is not allowed to follow their lenient opinion. Let's say if they permitted something he thinks is forbidden, he's not supposed to follow them, as long as he did not present his arguments to them. However, once he presents his arguments to them, and they still insist that he is wrong, so now he is not allowed any longer to insist. This is the idea, as I said in the beginning, of Jewish unity, that ideally, right, there won't be many Torahs and every rabbi will have his own Torah. So if the rabbi presented his arguments to the chief Sanhedrin and they still rejected it, from now on he has to follow their psak, and he's not allowed to be strict in what they were lenient. And if it's a mistake, like I said, it's a mistake, and then the Sanhedrin is going to carry the guilt, and will have to get kapara, to get forgiveness for whatever mistake they made. But at least the people will follow the same psak. That's very important. And of course, we're praying 3 times a day in Shmoneh Esrei, Hashiva Shoftenu Kivarishana, and eventually Sanhedrin will be back. We'll have Supreme Court that will be listened to by all the Jews. It's hard to believe we're such a divided nation. How could all the Jews listen to the same Sanhedrin? Sephardim, Ashkenazim, right? How are we going to all have one Sanhedrin that we're all going to listen to? But eventually we will. Eventually we have to. And we hope and pray 3 times a day for this to come. For us to see the sages of Sanhedrin, the 71 greatest sages deciding halacha. And if you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.